Welcome to Neurodivergent Faith, a podcast to help you navigate the beautiful and complicated intersection of neurodivergence and Christian faith and practice. My name's Josh Davis. I'm autistic, ADHD, a spiritual director, and an ordained pastor. And I'm delighted to have you join me as we explore the unique ways neurodivergent people experience God, worship, community, and scripture, along with special interests, sensory and attention differences, social and communication challenges, and much more. Well, hello, everyone. Today on Neurodivergent Faith, we're stepping into a conversation that very well may feel tender. You know, we're in the series of considering parenting, and we're looking at it from a variety of different perspectives. What some of us wish our caregivers had known or done differently, what it was like to grow up undiagnosed, what does healthy parenting of neurodivergent kids look like, and especially as some of us are neurodivergent parents and are reparenting ourselves, even as we parent our kids. So today I'm really excited to have this conversation with the authors of the book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. Marissa Franks, Burt, and Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis. In this book, they gently but honestly examine the systems, assumptions, and teachings that have shaped Christian parenting culture and the impact that those have had on real families. In this conversation, we're going to explore some of the hidden costs of one-size-fits-all approaches, the experiences of neurodivergent and marginalized families, and an invitation towards something more spacious, more humane, and perhaps more reflective of the heart of Jesus. So just want to say welcome, Marissa and Kelsey. So glad that you're here to join us today for this conversation.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading your book, and I was delighted and surprised to see the word neurodivergent on page 4. As someone who just doesn't expect to be noticed or named or considered in this kind of space, that felt really welcoming that you have that awareness. And so I'd love to start with maybe just what motivated each of you to spend your time and your energy and your heart to write this book. And then also, if you're willing, what got the word neurodivergent into the first few pages?
Good questions. I can start by sharing why I have no interest in writing a parenting book. I'll just say, but I, as a new parent, found myself very troubled by the resources that I was given and by the resources that were in use in my faith communities. And when my oldest, who's now 8, was around 1, I started just going out and looking for resources outside of the Christian parenting world that I was familiar with, because I felt like there was this massive gap between what these resources were telling me to do in response to her just having a hard time. And as I watched her having a hard time doing normal things, doing normal toddler things, learning to do things, saying no, these things that to me, the description rebellion and sin, I was uneasy with that description. And so I found myself going to look for other resources and ended up down this rabbit trail that lasted for years and years of just finding new ways to understand my daughter's behavior. I'm not an early childhood educator. I did not do a lot of babysitting. I was not someone who was familiar with the language of child development. But I was familiar with the language of the rights of children because I was working for a think tank at the University of Iowa that was wrapping up a grant project on the rights of children. So I was trying to just square all of these things with my faith and my own experience. And it took quite a while. Not that I've arrived at any point now, but it's sort of, I found myself trying to figure out a new roadmap for parenting that made sense, that respected the dignity of children, that also acknowledged my faith. And I just had a hard time finding it. So that's how I ended up doing this research and being interested in writing this book. And one of the things that Marissa and I found really early on was that one of the major shortcomings of the Christian parenting books that we read in our research was that they do not acknowledge differences in development. They don't acknowledge just sort of basic child development. They don't acknowledge differences in things like social determinants of health. Just none of that language is anywhere in here. And so we really wanted to acknowledge early on that if you're someone who's been harmed by some of these resources, that may be in part due to the fact that people writing them had the most narrow view of what a good family is and the most narrow view of what a good child is. So that's a little bit of background from me. Marissa, what's your story?
Oh yeah, that sparks so many thoughts. Marissa here, responding. First of all, I would say a piece of including the neurodivergence language is the recognition, as Kelsey said, of the narrow definition, even adjusting for the vocabulary of the day. Right, we were looking at resources from 1970 on primarily. We surveyed over 100 resources, both print and audio, sermons, things like that. And even if you're trying to adjust, this conversation has changed a lot. I've been parenting for a couple decades now, and the conversation I remember that was happening in the doctor's offices or in playgroups around neurodivergence is different than it was 20 years ago. So we tried to even adjust for that to say, well, were they trying to reference these concepts in a way that would have been common in the 80s? But no, it very much is one size fits all. There's no space to consider anything on a grand scale that diverges from the ideal that's being presented by these leaders, pastors, and teachers who primarily are just writing from their own experiences or from what's been handed down to them. So there's not just inaccuracies in the teachings that they offered, there's an incompleteness. There just is a lack of awareness and a lack of curiosity. So we wanted to observe that from the beginning to sort of say, man, we're only scratching the surface of this topic, but we did want our work to be accessible to readers from a variety of backgrounds. Not just because we believe that's the reality, but as an antidote to some of that one note that threaded throughout so much of this parenting content, to just all throughout our book, to be trying to return agency to people, to acknowledge that the people don't fit this one size formula. Families aren't that way. There's not a prescriptive sense of that even in scripture from across millennia. Yes, I came to this work because a couple of things. I'm married to a pastor, an Anglican priest. I've been in parish ministry for a number of years. And around the time I started being interested in this topic, an abuse crisis was occurring in my own denomination. So this combination of seeing how the church family systemically responded to people who had been injured had me asking questions about the ways our theology, our teaching directly enables abuse, certainly in high control religious settings, but even those echoes of that throughout every denomination, and our incapacity to hear the children of the church crying out in pain, our incapacity to listen to that. And I saw in that a reflection of what was happening in both my peers, adult children, as well as older parents in the pews, describing inauthentic connection and estrangement, this inability to discuss painful things that occurred in their families, inability to discuss a child's perspective, frankly, and inability for older parents to hear that. And so that had me curious and wondering, how come this book hasn't been written? A lot of things have been deconstructed or analyzed or talking about it, but parenting books, and they had such an outsized influence. And so one day I tweeted about it. Someone had asked, like, if you could write about anything, what would you write about? And the response was enough to think, well, maybe this is the time, and maybe I have something I could bring here. I mean, people were saying, yes, I would read that. I wish I had that when I was a young parent. I would love to engage with something like that. And then Kelsey responded. That's how we met. We met on Twitter, actually. Oh. And she had been thinking through some of these things on her own. And then as we talked about it, we said, hey, do you want to give this a go together? Because we thought our backgrounds really complemented each other, her academic and journalistic background, my pastoral ministry and theological background. We kind of together could, I think, write a stronger book. And that was the origin story of it. And that was about 3 years ago when we first connected.
Oh, that's really cool. Thanks for sharing some of that. It helps me to hear kind of where this is coming from in your own stories and your own experiences, And I hear you saying, like, I wish this book existed so that I could have benefited from it. So thank you for being willing to do the hard work
Mhm.
of the research and writing it. I have so many things highlighted from your book, and I'm just going to pick some and we can talk about them. But first, wanted to start on page 4, where you say many Christian parenting experts assume that successful families all look the same. And then you go on to say most authors don't address neurodivergence or disability, even adjusting for awareness at the time of writing. The majority of the most influential evangelical parenting experts are white. And then you go on to say, while many of the authors in this niche would likely say that their advice is quote unquote biblical and thus applicable across racial, socioeconomic, and geographic boundaries, as we will see, each author's background, experience, ideologies, and assumptions shape their parenting advice. So let's talk about that for a bit. What are the dangers of calling something quote unquote biblical as it relates to parenting when it's actually heavily filtered through culture and ideology, etc.? What did you see in your research? What have you personally experienced about that?
Yeah, the the term biblical is such a convenient marketing term in ways that continue to disturb me. As someone who does a lot of reporting on Christian subculture and kind of the weird niche things in there, biblical is a really helpful, useful, convenient marketing term for someone looking to sell books, advice, media to evangelical Christians, especially. And this is partly because evangelical Christians have inherited a kind of narrow form of biblical inerrancy as an approach to scripture. This that in many communities, the outgrowth of it is that the Bible is sort of treated as this like collection of little proof textable bits that can just be pulled out and applied out of context, attached to things, as they're sort of just used as pull quotes over and over again in ways that make it very easy for someone to give a piece of advice, slap a verse on it, and say, see, the Bible says so. This is evergreen, timeless wisdom from above. And you get someone like James Dobson who says very explicitly, like, I'm not giving you my ideas. I'm just telling you what God's will for the family is. And when you have Christians who believe that, the Bible is this ultimate authority and here's how this is, and he's using it the way you're supposed to use it, that can be very convincing. And for parents who are already anxious about getting parenting wrong, it's this high stakes thing in the Christian world. I mean, it's high stakes everywhere, but in evangelical Christianity of the 1970s and 80s, especially,
Yeah.
You end up with parents trying to implement these things, follow the letter of the law. And when you have someone like James Dobson, who's giving advice based on his experience with very young children in the 70s, and also based on, experience in the classroom that he sort of cobbled together to offer parenting advice, you end up with his worldview sort of packaged in a set of pieces of advice for parents that are very much informed by his conservative politics, by cultural panic of the time, by the political forces of the time. And all of those things sort of get washed away in this book that is presented as, here, parents, like, if you help discipline your kids, you can help right the ship of American culture. I mean, but it all ends up landing as this is the way to raise good, godly kids in a world gone awry.
Yeah, and I would say it is so understandable why that's appealing, particularly to people who respect the scriptures, who
Yes.
desire to please God. But that makes it very difficult to think critically or walk away from some of this teaching, because it either requires, in the language of today, a kind of deconstruction, or it requires a willingness to sort of say, well, that pastor or that spiritual authority figure says this is biblical, but I'm going to challenge that. And depending what corner of the church you're in, that can be really intimidating. There can be community pressure not to, or it can feel unsafe. And we come across this all the time in conversations around corporal punishment, because there's almost this knee-jerk conditioning to say this is biblical. So any conversation around it is slippery slope. We are about to throw the Bible out, and that people understandably don't want to do that, and are often ill-equipped to do that because it's been presented as this kind of faux humility of it's not my words, but it's God's words. So I don't think these people would necessarily say they're the mouthpiece for God, but they are setting themselves up to be that, and often taking passages that maybe have multiple interpretations, or as Kelsey said, are completely out of context, and creating parenting frameworks from a collection of texts that have very little to say about parenting methodology. Very little, even if we mine for that, there's very little to say. So that is being presented, and the overall effect of this kind of one size fits all approach is that people are perceived as kind of machines, and the Bible is this appliance manual for life. Like it's God's roadmap. So if you just read the manual, you can figure out how to get the machines to run properly. And this is often directly said. And as a result, children and adults are treated as machines who need to kind of figure out what they put off and what they put on, and how to like get their behavior correct so they can function in what's being presented as this biblical and godly way. It really becomes a kind of behaviorism, and it reduces people not just to one size fits all, but to kind of a depersonalized sum of their behavior, and presents God as a deity who's primarily interested in people's behavior and in the way they look on the outside. So it becomes problematic in how it plays out. Of course, it impacts people's relationship with God, their perception of God. It also impacts the way they relate to the world, their own self-perception. And when you combine that with a lack of awareness of child development, human development, neurodiversity, often it comes with lots of messages about shame or guilt or confusion, because punishment is occurring for things that are developmentally appropriate, that are a piece of someone's neurodivergent response, but it's all kind of mushed up together with this idea of like, you need to be a good Christian and you need to stop sinning, and those are kind of the only language that parents and families are given to describe what maybe is normal human development, typical or atypical, like however we would describe it.
Right.
They've only got sin, obedience framework. That's it.
Wow. Well, there's so much there that I'd like to double click on with you, and I think to some of it eventually. But I was just even thinking at the beginning of what you were sharing, how as an autistic kid, I didn't know I was autistic, but my autistic brain has been my filter my whole life. It just didn't make sense to me to hear people say, this is biblical, when someone at another church that I was connected to said, well, this is biblical. And then when I moved to other countries and lived in other countries, it was like, well, this is a different expression of the Bible. And then one pastor is saying, well, let's take this verse, but let's ignore these 12 verses. And as a 7-year-old, like that just didn't make sense to me. So I wanted to read another quote here that I think will get us into some more of what you were just talking about. You say, in many Christian communities, docile, obedient children are evidence of a firmly established authority structure in the home. Quote unquote, good behavior is a signpost of a child's bright future, and bad behavior ultimately is traced back to the parents. As a result, the inability to control, rein in, or command one's children is seen as a moral failure. That is the water that I swam in growing up. That resonates so deeply with me. And it was what was put on me as a parent as well. And so it led me to parent my kids, especially early on, in some of the same ways that I was parented, which now I understand my three of my four kids are diagnosed autistic and ADHD as well. Since my diagnosis, my three of my kids and my wife have all been diagnosed as well. And I was forcing them to mask because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. And that's what I had been forced to do um, for so many reasons. But mostly for their own selves to be seen as good Christian kids and for me and my wife to be seen as good Christian parents. Can you speak to some of the effects of that on some of the people that you interviewed and how does that play out later in life? I know those effects in my own body, but I would love to hear what you noticed and discovered in your research.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that you point out both the ways this impacts your experience as a child under it and your experience as then a parent, because children who are raised with these kinds of expectations, who are neurodivergent, grow up being penalized for the ways that they don't conform to this ideal. And in some communities, this leads to very explicit pitting of children against each other, even within families, right? Like, this is one way that children get labeled problematic or behavior problems, even in churches, right? Well-meaning volunteers who don't have any other language are kind of putting kids in good bad categories very early on in churches. I run into this when I do some reporting on what churches are trying to do to make worship spaces more inclusive. I've done some writing about that. And something that people run into again and again are these ingrained ideas, especially among older people, that children know they can. This child can behave. They just haven't been taught. They just haven't been forced. They haven't been disciplined. There's this sense that by accommodating and expanding our understanding of what appropriate child behavior is like giving up something. It's us being too soft on these kids. We shouldn't have to accommodate for a child who can't sit still through a service. They can. You're just not willing to make them, is something that comes up over and over again. Like, they will, you just have to make them. And that is so, one, it's not true. Second, it begs this question, but why do you need that to be true? Why do you want that to be true? And I think for some adults, it's because I was made to do that. I did it. I was forced to do it. And I think that that's hard for everybody. It brings up a lot of hurt for adults who haven't had to think about that hurt in a long time. That's kind of long buried for some people. And in some cases, you have parents who are forcing it, who are white knuckling it and making their kids do it. And that if I can do it, you can do it too. It's just sad all around in ways that when I talk with parents who are experiencing it, it robs authentic communities of chances to connect with each other and find ways to make children part of this community in a more authentic, connected way so that they actually have a real sense of belonging. In communities that are struggling with this, there is a sense that there are some people who belong and some people who don't belong.
Mhm.
And for me, those are some of the most heartbreaking results of this that I see. And the children in it are confused. They are hurt. They are often in kind of a fight or flight because they know they don't belong. And the parents are also on high alert because they're trying to prove that their children belong. They're trying to prove that they belong. And that's so hard for everybody. And it's a big reason why people end up leaving church altogether until their children are older.
Yeah, I was one of those kids who was able to conform on the outside, but no one cared. No one cared about what that meant was happening to me on the inside. And so I just learned that what God wants is that I show up and I behave the right way. And if I do that, then God is happy and the community is happy and quote unquote, I belong. But the reality was, I knew I didn't belong because I wasn't even present in those spaces. I was just offering what I knew everyone wanted and needed me to offer. So they weren't distressed. So their belonging wasn't challenged. So they didn't have to deal with discomfort. And that produced a lot of tension inside me, and even that I carried into adulthood until I started to realize, wait, the Bible talks a lot about not just the outward behavior, but what's happening in the heart. Where is it coming from? Is it motivated by fear? Is it motivated by shame? Then really, is that what we want? We want good behavior that's motivated by fear or shame? Or are we actually working against what we really do long for and need?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Heard similar from a number of people. And I think many of them reflected on their childhoods as a confusing time where things, like you mentioned earlier, didn't make sense to them, but they saw the adults in their life acting this way. They didn't understand why they were treated differently from a sibling. We heard from neurotypical siblings who would say, yep, my sibling who was late in life diagnosed was spanked all day long, like this kind of often children who were undiagnosed neurodivergent were on the receiving end of ruthless corporal punishment that escalated abuse, things like this, because compliance was so much the prize.
Yeah.
And if they couldn't or didn't deliver on that, the parent would simply escalate. So I think that is a big piece of it. I wonder, I don't know how you'd get at this, but I do think the late in life diagnosis is a common theme. Obviously, there, as we mentioned, there was no vocabulary for this in many evangelical communities, or there was antagonism to it. And you still see this. There were a few books that talked about autism as demonic, or there were people like John MacArthur saying, this isn't a thing, ADHD isn't a thing, or in the particularly nouthetic influenced resources. So that led to a lot of destructive behaviors out of ignorance. So you certainly had that, but I think for a lot of people, it just simply wasn't part of the conversation. And so I think, yeah, it makes sense that there's late in life diagnosis. It's interesting to also think about, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Josh, because I was speaking with an autistic Christian who was kind of talking about this angle of how perhaps more neurodivergent people were also drawn to these very black and white rules for parenting.
Sure.
So maybe there was something there that was appealing to say, well, here's kind of an ideal we can follow. It's very clear. And that kind of made for some really potent combinations when you have maybe parents who are very committed to an ideal that they perceive as like a right or wrong thing. And then enacting that out. So maybe even older generations of parents who themselves were undiagnosed or unaware of these things, but perhaps were most committed to these ideals and unable to walk away. So yeah, I think it's something I know more conversations are happening. I see people writing about this more in the Christian parenting space. So I'm very curious to see some of those books come out. A friend of ours, Sunita Tice, is working on a book in this area. I think it'll be great to hear Christian adults who have walked that path, who have kind of had that your experience you're describing as children, who have kind of learned about themselves as adults as they are parenting. I think that will be shed some really long overdue light on what this experience was like for a number of people.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that. Yeah, Sunita's been a guest on the podcast twice, having conversation with her. Yeah, there's something here that's catching my attention that's complex because at one level, we're saying, or traditional parenting, Christian parenting models, we're saying it's the behavior that we care about, it's compliance. But then on the other hand, the parents are assuming that they know what's in the heart of the child. And I want to read just a couple of quotes around that, and maybe we can talk about how it plays out and what the problems with that are. Here you say, to label a child strong-willed and prescribe responses to their behavior according to that label is to dismiss the possibility that there is something valid and distinct distinct about their particular response to the world, which makes me think like a strong-willed child behavior, like a tantrum or like a refusal to wear a shirt, for example, could just be about the fact that the shirt is so uncomfortable and the parents have no idea, right? But then we label the child strong-willed, and it's as if we know where that's coming from, right? And then you said in another instance, actually, this is a quote from one of the people you interviewed named Rachel. Motivations were assumed and ascribed by those in authority. And if an authority ascribed a motive to something you did, you accepted their judgment as being right, since you thought yourself incapable of truly knowing your own motives and would never argue with an adult. That is such the experience that I had, because to argue with an adult was to argue with God. Argue with God was to risk not receiving anything good for the rest of your life, because children obey your parents in the Lord, for this is how it will go well with you, right? It's all connected and tied together. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. This connection between behavior and the heart is just assumed. Like I think it's worth saying that James Dobson's 1970 book Dare to Discipline is pretty purely behaviorist in terms of how he talks about teaching and conditioning children to do desirable behavior and not do non-desirable behaviors. And there is this sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken belief that behavior just is evidence of what's inside. And this traces to other parts of Christian thought as well. This idea that the exterior is just an outflowing of what's in here. So you can trust if your child is behaving in a way that is undesirable to you, there's something undesirable going on in there, even if they could never articulate what it is, right? Even down to a baby not sleeping or not wanting to stay in their crib, right? There's something undesirable happening in the heart, and it's coming out through this rebellious behavior, this rebellion against your will. And that breaks down so easily when you start doing a very cursory reading about how child development works, about how and about how humans work in general, right? Like adults don't play by those rules either, for a number of reasons. But there is this commitment to the idea that behavior reflects the heart or sin nature in some way. And that is both black and white in a convenient way, and seems to give parents a smoking gun to come down on behavior they don't like, right? If it is that simple, if it's that formulaic, then there's no guesswork, and there's no need for things like empathy that are quite messy. There's no need to try to understand the exact reason why a child might be melting down at a moment, right? It doesn't matter if you're hungry. It doesn't matter if you don't feel well. You just need to comply. And some books come right out and say that. Ginger Hubbard is someone who would say that. I don't care if you're sick, you can still obey, right? This idea that like you are utterly in control of everything you do at all times, which we know is not true. And these authors just don't want to acknowledge that as a possibility, because that makes it that opens so many more gray areas and so much more this space where discernment and relationship are the only answer to those problems. But those are not optimizable. Those are not formulaic in any way that would translate to a compelling parenting book.
Right. And I like to think of behavior as communication, but I think where it breaks down is the parent assumes that this behavior means this because perhaps in their framework, and if they were to do that behavior, that's what it would mean, but they're misattributing the meaning and motivation to the behavior. And oftentimes, parents and children, especially if one is neurotypical and one is neurodivergent, they're communicating in different ways. They're speaking different languages effectively. And so we're reading the behavior and we're interpreting it through our lens and not getting curious about what's actually going on for the child. And then I was actually one of those kids who really bought in to all of that and really did believe like I can control every reaction and I will. And so when I was in my diagnosis process several years ago, one of the assessments is for masking neurodivergent traits. And I scored off the charts because That's what I had been taught to do, to self-monitor and control every eye movement, every facial expression, every tone of voice. But what happened as a result is I wasn't connecting to anyone. I wasn't even connecting to myself. I was just showing up the way you're supposed to show up.
Mhm.
And I was so lonely and disconnected on the inside as well as in my relationships.
That's so key. That last piece, just the disconnection. Like it is more important that you behave than that you connect. So just disconnect so that you can micromanage all of the behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Gosh, that's such a
Yeah.
heartbreaking experience.
It is. And even some of the resources that attempt to frame as connection, like I do think TED Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart or the book Parenting by Paul David Tripp, these are efforts to perhaps resist the conditioned behaviorism of the Dobson era. And it's interesting when you read them because sometimes there will be scripts for connection offered to parents in those books. But what's fascinating is the end goal is always obedience. It is understand your child's heart according to these presuppositions that we're going to give you that kind of evaluate everything through sin categories, but connect with your child so that you can tell them how they're disobeying, so that you can identify the sin at play here. And so even though it maybe comes across as softer or there's an effort at like have this conversation to try and figure out what's going on, the parent is still trying to kind of suss out sin and diagnose a problem that then they're going to solve through coercion or sermonizing, right? Like this is how they're going to still control the outcome because, and theological ideas play into this, ideas that sin is at the root of everything. Even things that are hard are because of sin, is a piece of it. I also think a piece of it is parenting is triggering. And a lot of times parents, particularly in the really high intense seasons of early parenting, are just reactive. And they don't know why it feels intolerant to them that their child is melting down, but it feels intolerant, it feels unsafe, and things are just happening so fast. And they hear this voice in the back of their head, like, delayed obedience is disobedience, or obey right away, all the way with a happy heart. These things that messages maybe they internalized or have picked up in their community. And so there's just a pressure cooker on everyone too, that I think contributes to this, where parents are responding so quickly. And then you have these formulas that are like, you say this, and then you often hit or punish, and then you get the result you want. And when that's really established as normative in the early years, I think it just kind of takes off from there. And everyone operates in this, as you've mentioned, totally disconnected state, which is why, and we heard this from so many people, down the road, the receipt comes due and people are left picking up the pieces. People are very ill-equipped to cultivate authentic connection as adult children and older parents. Sometimes for older parents, it's a complete surprise to hear about their adult child's inner experience. And it is disorienting for them because they took that cheerful external compliance to be authentic connection. And so it's kind of like perplexing for them to hear, like, what? We thought we were good. We thought we were this happy family. We thought you believed this. We thought all of this. And so it really robs families of opportunities to connect as well, and leaves them ill-equipped to do that at every stage. And instead, they've kind of been practicing day in and day out these rituals for external compliance. So yeah, a number of things, but we did hear, particularly as people recounted their stories, so many resonating with these themes that led to inauthentic connection. And I don't know if this is a word, but like self-estrangement, like they didn't know themselves
Absolutely.
well into adulthood. They didn't know their own desires because there was no space for that. They didn't know their own responses, or they had been taught that the response they experienced was bad or sinful. We also heard from people where this led to scrupulosity and religious OCD because they were constantly examining their motives or evaluating, as you described, their behavior and kind of this, it was a survival mode, but this kind of obsessive way because that is how they had to fit in or receive affection or not get a spanking. And so it led to so many complex layers that are difficult to sort through, particularly when you're also actively parenting. It's a lot of work. And I think a lot of people are navigating that right now.
Yeah. I'm going to say something I've never said out loud, and we'll see how it goes. But I think a lot of times what was happening in those kinds of situations um, is that we were asking kids to sin against themselves
Mm,
in order to not sin against God and not sin against parents. And
mm,
this is my theological perspective, and I own it. You don't have to agree. I'm open to disagreement, but I see sin as a disconnector, right? And so
mm,
when those things were disconnecting on the inside of me, I now see those through the lens of, wow, I was sinning against myself. Now I have such compassion on
mm,
myself because I didn't really have another option that I knew of. But all of this maps onto our relationship with God. So
mm,
if
mm.
a child thinks that obedience is the end goal with parents, then obedience is the end goal with God,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And you mentioned this quote, but I wanted to read it from one of the people that you interviewed who is anonymous. They say, I feel like sin was taught as the core of our identity. My parents were even hesitant to say God heard us when we prayed as children because we were still unsaved sinners. And then they go on to say, I was very much taught that Jesus had died for my sins and that he wanted to save me, but the emphasis on obedience to the law and our sinful nature was heavy. As I grew older, a continual cloud of guilt and shame seemed to be at the core of who I was. As a young person, I began to exhibit signs of scrupulosity or religious OCD, though I would not have had the words for it until I was much, much older. I feared that I had committed the unpardonable sin. I would go through phases where I would feel the need to apologize for the slightest thing, and I would search my motives to see if I could write the word love at the end of a letter to someone I genuinely cared about. As I grew older, intrusive thoughts started to come in, and with them, confusion and guilt. And I've heard so many people with similar stories, and especially for brains that are wired to be more literal in our thinking and our interpretation, it is not a far jump. It's just a very small step. And all of these things line up, and it just makes logical sense
Mhm.
that we would then end up policing our behaviors and questioning everything that we do.
Yeah, the language of self-betrayal when you were talking about the sin as disconnection is a piece of it. And there's a lot of grief, I think, and anger for people as they work through this that comes up. Yes, grief at what happened, but also, yeah, all those points of disconnection or that because you don't get those years back, right? Like if you've been formed in a religious community that has presented you primarily as a sinner from birth and has cultivated all of this in the language of the Bible, these are stumbling blocks, right? These are things that shipwreck faith because it is difficult to approach God on fresh terms if you have been so well catechized into this idea that he is primarily concerned with behavior, is scrutinizing your behavior, kind of doesn't care who gets punished as long as someone gets punished, just wants you to conform, right? This is you're absolutely right. These things map with a view of God. And I think that's motivating a lot of the teaching to begin with. You hear these parenting experts when they recount childhood experiences, a lot of them sound abusive.
Yeah.
They'll let that slip. They're not naming it as such. It's often coming with jokes, it's often coming with humor, but they are recounting disconnected, detached, unsafe environments. They are operating in relationship with a God who is high control, who is interested in compliance. And often it is mapping in the community. The church family is operating that way. A big piece of why we wanted to do this work is to free people up, to challenge some of those narratives, to invite the question, what if that is an erroneous starting place? To encourage, to spotlight some of, we call them stowaway theological doctrines that are laced throughout this, where these resources were remarkably ecumenical. So someone may not have been in a corner of the church that said total depravity, but these books sure were talking about infants
Yep.
as totally depraved sinners. And so it's kind of this hodgepodge of unexamined theological assumptions, but the heartbeat of them is, yes, shame, guilt, obedience, behavior, redefining love to be punishment and inflicting pain, like a lot of messaging that doesn't hold up once you scrutinize it. It doesn't hold up to orthodox theology and orthopraxy. However, it continues to circulate, and it was what people were catechized by. So there's a lot of loss there. There's a lot to grieve, and there's a lot, frankly, to be angry about, I think, because it betrayed people. It taught people to betray themselves. It betrayed entire families. I think certainly, yes, abusive people were drawn to this, but I think a number of people were simply complying as parents to what they had been told they needed to do, and became both victim and victimizer to this in a very complicated way. So I don't know if we can ever know for sure how many families were impacted by this, but these resources were produced for millions and exported internationally as well. So the fallout, I think, is immense. And I suspect we're kind of on only the front wave of it.
Yeah, and so I'm imagining some of the people who might be listening today,
Mm.
a lot of heaviness because I feel it even as we're talking. And I found this book to be really helpful for me to process some of my own experiences growing up, and then some of the ways that I parented, especially early on with our kids. But I would love to take the last few minutes of our time together to share some hope because your book, I love that it doesn't just stop with analyzing what has been, but you actually have this whole section at the end where you encourage people to get curious about this and get curious about that. And you offer some hope at the end. So I wonder what's stirring in you today to offer in terms of the hope that you would share with people who have been parented in this way, maybe have parented in this way, and are trying to figure out, how do I parent?
Oh, gosh. I don't mean to sigh and sound like I don't have hopeful things to say. I do. It's just it's hard to choose or to sum it up.
If I'm being sincere, the sigh just feels like an honest response.
Well, I'll start with something disheartening and move into the hopefulness. So we are in a weird moment right now where I think parents and children feel more policed than they ever have, because we're in this era where someone could record you with a phone and post it on TikTok with like can you believe this? Or like, look at this disaster of parenting unfolding. That's a very real possibility. And I think parents feel that. It is a fear that James Dobson was preying on long before the internet by sharing anecdotes of parents.
Mhm.
This mother I saw on the bus who was harried, and this how awful, and she didn't know what to do with all of her kids, this fear of being watched and policed. I don't really know what hope I have to offer parents other than to say that fear of being policed in public for your parenting is something that has been weaponized against you for so long, but no one knows you and your kids the way you do. And connection with your kids is possible. A lot of these resources make parents feel like there is no real connection to be found, there's only control. And that's just not true. Like, I think deep down, you as a parent, you know that, right? Like, even if your child struggles to connect with you, there is connection to be found. There is authentic relationship to be found. Don't let someone tell you otherwise. Don't let someone tell you that the only thing to be found in a relationship with a toddler is control or compliance. Children are not adults. They are different. And I can't re-inhabit my 3-year-old brain to fully understand what it was like to be a toddler, but they are fully human. And they aren't little machines and they aren't pets. So your impulse to try to connect and understand is not being soft. It is not giving sin a pass. It is treating your child as fully human, created in the image of God. And Jesus was a child once. So acknowledging that is not you failing. And it's not you failing to discipline enough, being daring enough to discipline, or whatever an author is going to tell you you're doing. There's real relationship and connection to be found. And you can aspire to more than control.
gosh, so many things come to mind. I would say first, there's so much freedom for the Christian parent, for those actively parenting. There's so much freedom regarding methodology, regarding what you can explore, what you can try, like what you can learn about yourself and your family and your children's disposition. I think it's been helpful to invite people to consider children as neighbors, to say, look, children are our smallest and newest neighbors. We're fond of saying they are people who have been entrusted to parental care for a short period of time. In that sense, they don't belong to parents. I mean, belonging happens in family, the sort of like connectedness, but not in the sense of like you are an agent of God in their life to control them according to these compliance-based ways. They are people that the one anothering passages all throughout scripture apply to. And sometimes that can, I think, for people who feel like turning away from this kind of quote unquote biblical parenting feels like free fall, I think that can be a helpful invitation to say, perhaps there are other elements of the biblical narrative that you haven't thought to consider in light of your parenting, to kind of retrain our eyes to see children as neighbors and as people, and to consider Jesus's example that welcomed them, yes, but also his example of leadership, which was service. It was not top-down coercion. I would also say, and this is kind of scary, I think, for a lot of parents to say, reality is none of this worked anyway. Like, certainly when we talk about the fallout, but reality is you can't control another human being. It's just not possible. We see that God himself grants human beings agency. He does not control them. They are free to rebel in that sense. And we are not deities, even remotely. That can be really terrifying, I think, to acknowledge as a parent. I mean, the moment you bring that baby home, you realize how out of control you are. And I think it can be spark this whole grasp for controlling. But I would encourage people who still retain faith, the good news at the end of that free fall isn't like a report card for you getting it wrong or punishment for you failing to get it right. The good news is the incarnation, that God himself wanted to be with people. He wanted to connect with people. I know all of our theology is wrapped up in this, but he was not put off by sin. He came to be with us. He came right into the middle of us, middle of it, and walked with us. And in the Christian faith tradition teaches us, continues to come closer, dwells within us. And so I think revisiting the incarnation can be a helpful theological framing for people as well, both to consider Jesus as a child and to consider that maybe God wants to connect with us as well, and to sort of encourage people that what's waiting on the other side of rethinking these ideas isn't a cosmic spanking, but is the welcome of a father who, in the imagery of Jesus, doesn't punish the prodigal son, doesn't punish the angry elder son, simply is there with open arms and joy to welcome his children. And I think that kind of radical welcome and radical love and radical connection is something many of us have been longing for. And it can make us uncomfortable to hear about it because we feel like, when's the other shoe going to drop? But this is the testimony of the Gospels. It really is good news. So I would offer that to people and invite them to take a deep breath and try and relieve themselves, to set down that heavy basket, that heavy pressure cooker that maybe they've been operating in, particularly as parents, and to say, it's not my job to control all of this outcome. My job is to love this human being that's been entrusted to my care for a short time.
Yeah. What if the goal is not obedience, but what if the goal is connection with God?
Mm-hmm.
What if it's possible for us to connect with God in the messiness of our own journeys, of processing our own stories and parenting our children and getting it right sometimes and getting it wrong sometimes? And what if there's more possibility for connection with our children and to teach them what connection could look like and could feel like, how that would ripple out into society? That feels really hopeful to me. Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for your bravery to expose some things that, I'm sure a lot of people are not happy with having them exposed in black and white. Thank you for your willingness to consider another way and to create a resource that helps people think through things that you wish you had been
Mm.
able to just read somebody's book like this. You're offering that to us. I really appreciate that. And thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. We really appreciate you reading and engaging with it.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all listening as well. And we're happy to connect more if you like.
Mm-hmm.
We're across social media. But thanks. This was a delightful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just encourage everybody out there to check out the book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. How could they connect with you on social media if they wanted to follow up or hear more about what you all are doing?
We are both pretty active on Instagram and Threads. We both each have our own Substacks under our own name as well. And any one of those places I am and would respond to a message. So
and if you're interested, last year we did a limited run podcast kind of deep diving on some of these resources together in conversation. So you can check that out. It's called In the Church Library if you're, wanting more virtual conversation with us on this topic.
Wonderful. And we'll put all that in the show notes to make it easy for you. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Neurodivergent Faith. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this with someone who might need to hear it too. And as you continue to wrestle with faith and identity, remember, your unique brain is a part of God's creative genius. Whether it's the way you process scripture, engage with prayer, or connect with others, you are a reflection of the vast creativity of our Creator. May you trust that God knows you, delights in you, and is working in you exactly as you are. And may you know that you are not walking this journey alone. See you next time.